Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Williams. I welcome you to History Author Talks, and I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. And as we march toward the Christmas holiday, or in December, or what I call the 10 crucial days, obviously this is when Washington crossed the Delaware, and the battles of Trenton and Princeton took place. Obviously, also, as this is History Author Talks, today is December 7th. So we remember what happened, obviously, this being the day of infamy. Although this be the day of infamy, we have a wonderful program for you this evening. Before we do, I just want to mention a few things. First of all, you're all on mute, or you all should be on mute. And we will keep you on mute for the most of the show. And if you want to ask our author questions, though, I invite you to go to the bottom of the screen and use the chat. Always love having questions from the audience. That really helps make for a great show. So please use the chat. Those questions will come to me, and I will ask our author questions. A lot of my regulars, it's good to see you again. I also want to let you know that this being the 10 crucial, as we are going into December and the 10 crucial days, I invite you to visit 10crucialdays.org. 10crucialdays.org is the nonprofit that I co-founded that highlights the sites and venues of the battles of Washington crossing the Delaware and the battles of Trenton and Princeton. There's a lot going on at 10crucialdays.org. We show you all of those events, and if you are in the Middle Atlantic area or want to travel to Washington crossing in Princeton, there are plenty of links that show you how to get here and a lot of things to do. So we'd love to have you here. I also welcome all my compatriots from the Sons of the American Revolution. I am with the Sons of the American Revolution, and I know that many of our viewers are with the SAR. We have some wreath laying events with the President General on December 26th and January 2nd. You will also see those listed at the 10crucialdays.org website with all of the events. I also have an event coming up this Saturday with Patrick K. O'Donnell, author of Indispensables, about the Glover's Marbleheaders, is going to be here live in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, talking about his book. And then on Sunday at Washington Crossing is the First Crossing, which is a rehearsal for the reenactment of the Christmas Day crossing, which is a very exciting event on the banks of the Delaware River. So if you're in the Middle Atlantic area, you should come join us here at Washington Crossing. So with that, I want to always remind you that at historyauthortalks.com, you will be able to find our guests' books at the website at historyauthortalks.com. If you want to purchase our guests' books tonight, you go to historyauthortalks.com and you'll see a link to bookshop.org. A portion of the proceeds are donated to the Sons of the American Revolution Library. So with all of that, I'm now would like to introduce you to Woody Holton. Woody teaches early American history, especially the American Revolution, with a focus on economic history, on African Americans, Native Americans, and women. Professor Holton teaches undergraduate seminars on colonial America and the American Revolution. At the undergraduate level, he teaches the first half of U.S. History Survey, upper classes on early American women, the American Revolution, and early African Americans. In the near future, he will teach seminars on slave rebellions and on the history of capitalism in North America. Holton's 2009 book, Abigail Adams, which won which he wrote on a Guggenheim Fellowship, won the Bancroft Prize. Holton is the author of Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, finalist of the George Washington Book Prize and the National Book Award. His first book, Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia, won the Organization of American Historians Merle Curti Award. So to learn more, you can find Woody and the website at University of South Carolina. And with that, I'd like to welcome Woody Holton. And Woody, you can start telling us about your new book, or first tell us a little bit about your earlier books and how you've come to write the new book, Liberty is Sweet, which I hope everyone can, I'm going to add this here so you can see Liberty is Sweet, the Hidden History of the American Revolution, which is the focus of tonight's program. But first, Woody, if you can tell us a little bit about your earlier books and how you came to write Liberty is Sweet.
Well, thanks, Roger, and I really appreciate your having me on. So my first book was also my dissertation at Duke, and I arrived in grad school at Duke in '82 when the new social history was really taking off, focusing on all the people that aren't in Trumbull's painting. I see you have the death of General Mercer as your background, but everyone knows the presentation of the Declaration of Independence, all white men. And when I got to Duke, people were studying everybody else. You know, a fifth of the colonists were enslaved. Of course, half were women. Most of the territory, even east of the Mississippi, was still occupied by Native Americans. So they were the subject. And I was fascinated by that history, but I'd always been interested in political history. And so the question that I asked in my dissertation was about how do these intersect, the social history of ordinary people with the political history of famous people that we all know. And so that became a book published by the Omohundro Institute down in Williamsburg in 1999 called Forced Founders. And my argument was that there were some senses in which the people that we all know, I was focused on Virginia, people like Washington and Jefferson were pushed into rebellion by the influence of, for instance, Native Americans. And actually, Roger, if you'll let me steal the screen for a second, I'll show you what I mean about Native American influence. One thing the first thing I'll show you is that's familiar to everybody. Can you see a map now, Roger? Yeah, so the line that I'm tracing with my cursor is the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and that's the proclamation line of 1763. The British government, after an Indian rebellion that we call Pontiac's Rebellion, set that line as a western limit of its British colonists, not out of any sympathy for the Indians, but because the British government didn't want to have to pay for another war against the Indians. And that proclamation line really infuriated people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, all of whom were land speculators, as was Benjamin Franklin in Pennsylvania and many others. And so here was a case where Native Americans, by participating in Pontiac's Rebellion, they didn't send a representative to London, but in a sense they did, because they persuaded the British government to draw that line. It didn't stop actual settlers from just crossing the mountains and settling out there. But if you were a land speculator trying to get huge grants of 10,000 acres at a pop and then divide them up and sell them, you couldn't sell them unless you could get title to the land. The same way I can't sell my car unless I go find the title and sign it over to the person I'm selling the car to. So here's a case where Native Americans, I think, contributed one of the major grievances that shows up in the Declaration of Independence, this British attempt to limit Western expansion. So anyway, I promise not to spend as much time on my other books, but that was the first one, and that got me started on this idea of connecting what ordinary people, in this case Native Americans, were doing to what elites like George Washington were doing. And my second book was on the origins of the Constitution, where I ended up arguing a very economic interpretation, but not economic in the sense of, oh, the people who wrote the Constitution were greedy. Some of the people with us tonight might know that that is exactly the argument that a historian named Charles Beard made back in 1913. And I ended up not buying the Beard argument, but I did become persuaded that Madison and Hamilton and the other authors of the Constitution believed that the economy was in a terrible recession. Actually, everybody agreed on that. But they believed the solution was to take power away from the state governments, because they believed the state governments had been too responsive to their constituents and therefore too irresponsible, not responsible enough in adopting legislation specifically to help people who, that is creditors like our credit card companies now, or the bank that I owe money to on my mortgage. One of the main purposes of the Constitution that nobody hears about today was to make it easier for those creditors to collect money from their debtors. Because if they could do that, then they'd lend money in the future. And the framers of the Constitution believed that's how you get out of recession, is you persuade the people with money to invest to actually go out and invest it. So that book was called Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution. Then I did a book on Abigail Adams, a biography of her that was kind of an outgrowth of the Constitution book, because she had a very interesting financial interest in the Constitution that I could talk to you about. But I also discovered, to my surprise and delight, that Abigail Adams did something much more radical than the one thing that everybody else knows about her. You know, she's best known for writing that Remember the Ladies letter to John Adams, her husband. But in fact, the men did not remember the ladies. Almost nothing was done for women by any of the state legislatures, or even the new renegade state of Vermont didn't do much for women. But and they continued the English common law, where once you're married, you own no property. You don't write a will if you're a woman, but because you have nothing to devise. But Abigail Adams did that anyway. That is, she made a bunch of money for her husband and then set a portion of that aside and started referring to it as hers, even though she was married. And when she wrote a will, still married, her husband ended up outliving her, but she wrote a will even though she wasn't supposed to do it, in defiance of the law. And I thought that was really in the spirit of the revolution, that she was asserting her rights, the notion that all men and women are created equal. So I had tremendous fun writing about her. And so that brings us up to Liberty is Sweet, which is, I wrote one book that's a lot about Native Americans and African Americans, one that's about economic history, one that's about Abigail Adams and other women. And this book is trying to bring them all together with one more element that I will confess I didn't know much about 12 years ago when I started this book, and that's the military conflict. A lot of academic historians, I will be candid with you, turn up their noses at the military conflict. They only want to talk about the highfalutin political ideas, which we're all interested in, or religious thought, or everybody's got their specialty, but there's a real snobbery against military history, and I was part of it until I started studying it. And I ended up concluding that there have been a lot of tremendously exciting works on our military history of the Revolution, and that that there's a lot new to say about the military history. So I hope we have a chance to talk about the battles, because I ended up really thinking that there's a lot new to say about them as well.
That's terrific. So yeah, and having read the book, I can assure everybody that there's a good overview of all of the military campaigns. So it's a delightful mixture of not only the military campaigns, but also the social history. So tell us, how did you come to write Liberty is Sweet?
Because the big thing I wanted to do that other historians weren't doing was integrate the multiple histories of the Revolution. And I'll tell you that there was a great book, I think it was published in 2015 about then, by Alan Taylor, who has won Pulitzer Prizes for two of his other books about that era. But this one was on the Revolution, and he called it American Revolutions with an S. And I think that's really true, that we all think about the struggle of the colonists against the redcoats, nicely depicted by the image behind you, but it was so many more things than that. For instance, the struggle that I mentioned in the West between Native Americans and colonists who wanted their lands. 1/5 of Americans were enslaved, and they were struggling for their freedom even before the revolution, but the revolution really gave them a lot of opportunities to become free, mostly by fighting on the American side in the North, where only 10% of them lived, and by fighting on the British side, actually, in the South, where the rest lived. It's a kaleidoscope. There is so much going on that's why Alan Taylor called his book American Revolutions, but he didn't go as far as people used to, where people used to have, a chapter on the back on blacks and a chapter behind that on women and a chapter behind that on Native Americans. He at least had within each of his chapters, he'd have a section about African Americans and a chapter on Native Americans and one on women. And what I'm trying to do is go even further than that. And that is to write a straight up chronological history of the revolution in which everybody is integrated into the same narrative. And really, I think that this is the first book to do that, to tell everybody's story as one story, not as a series of different stories.
Give us a breakdown, give our audience a breakdown in terms of, your narrative flow and how you put this together. It is chronological, for sure. Are there aspects of the chronology in terms of your structure of your writing and your research that you feel bring something new to this story that more and more books are being written about?
I hope so, and I certainly tried. For instance, even if we just focus for a second on what got us to July 2nd, 1776, when the Continental Congress declared independence. Even if you just focus on that first part and forget about the war, which of course started the previous 2 Aprils before that. But if we just focus on why the heck did they declare independence, I realize, I've been teaching for 30 years, asking the question with students, getting students involved in that question, why did the colonists declare independence? And I've realized I've been asking the wrong question all along for 2 reasons. One is that process was divided into stages. And from any one stage in that process, at best, the most foresighted people could see the next stage, but nobody could see 2 moves down the chessboard, much less 3 or 4. And as I said, it's a 4-stage process. So that's one thing that's wrong with saying, why did the colonists rebel against Britain? But there's a more fundamental problem with that question that I asked for 30 years, which is the colonists didn't rebel against Britain. In a real sense, it was Parliament that rebelled against the status quo of 1762. Because if you went around, and of course we didn't have pollsters, but if you read their letters, it's clear, whether you're reading John Hancock in Massachusetts or Benjamin Franklin in Pennsylvania or George Washington in Virginia, as of 1762, they were thrilled with their relationship to the British Empire. Who was not thrilled was Parliament, because John Hancock and others in New England were smuggling molasses up from the Caribbean islands of Jamaica. Jamaica they could legally import, but they couldn't get enough molasses from Jamaica, so they were getting it from Spanish islands like Cuba and French islands like Martinique and Guadeloupe. So they were smuggling molasses, and they were smuggling wine against the whole mercantilist system that Parliament had set up before. So smuggling's going on. I've already mentioned swiping lands from Indians, which the British don't like because they're the ones who have to pay for the war that gets stirred up when the Indians get provoked. And so my point is that if you go through the chronology of the revolution, you really see Parliament on the offense, and the colonists, all they want to do is to turn back the clock to 1762, when they were really satisfied with that relationship. And I'd even go so far as to use this provocative word from English history, What the colonists wanted up until 1774 was restoration, to just put things back the way they were before before Parliament started meddling with things by taxing the colonies, by drawing that line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and so forth. So to try to make it sound intellectual, I use the word stadial view, that is Stadial, because you've got to see it in stages. And then the first stage is really Parliament on the offense. And then the second stage is the colonists resisting those changes that Parliament wanted, doing things like tarring and feathering customs agents and burning the stamps during the Stamp Act riots and so forth. But then all of those resistance measures on the part of the colonists provoked Parliament in turn to go on the offensive again, this time with punishments. For instance, the coercive acts in 1774 that closed the port of Boston and transformed Massachusetts' government, that gave all the land north of the Ohio River to Quebec, which actually wasn't meant to be punitive, but it was seen that way by the colonists. And the most extreme thing the British did to punish the colonists for all their resistance was the governor of Virginia, which was the most populous state, Lord Dunmore, on November 15th, 1775, he issued an Emancipation Proclamation that wasn't identical to Lincoln's, but it had a lot in common with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, in that it said to the 40% of Virginians who were enslaved, if you can get to my lines, and by the way, you also had to be owned by a patriot, and if you'll fight for your king, then I'll free you. And that infuriated white Virginians, and other governors did it in a less formal way. So did Royal Navy captains. One Virginian really put their reaction well, aiming a dagger at our throats through the hands of our slaves. And that really infuriated them. And that's, I think it was that, plus Lexington and Concord in New England, the use of Hessian soldiers and so forth. It was these things that Parliament was doing. I have to try to do this with my hands, things that Parliament was doing to punish the colonists for their resistance to the measures that Parliament had initially adopted, like the Stamp Act. It's only after that process. So we get Parliament taking initiatives, the colonists protesting those initiatives, Parliament punishing the colonists for those protests. It's those punishments, like Dunmore's proclamation, and like sending the troops out to Concord and hiring Hessians. It's those punishments that is what persuades the colonists to declare independence. The Stamp Act was not enough to make anybody declare independence.
Let's take a step back a little bit and dig into the weeds here. So one key takeaway that we gain from Liberty is Sweet is that parliaments need, we still have the map up on the screen here. Parliaments need.
How can I unshare that? I'll stop. Oh, I'm sorry.
Leave it up. Well, okay. So we all saw the map.
Oh, I'm sorry. You want to see it again? I took it down just when you wanted it. Okay.
That's okay. We all know the line. So that parliaments need to protect its newfound territory post French and Indian War, the imperial borders, from foreign incursion and from the Indians. But also to corral its own expansionist-minded subjects from going into these indigenous lands. Given that the British America had already enjoyed over 150 years of unfettered expansion and home rule, can you expound a little bit on the Whig policies in Great Britain, both in Parliament and the citizenry? I mean, not all of Parliament was in favor of punishing the colonists, were they?
No, and in fact, even the people who did do these things, like Grenville, who was the progenitor of the Stamp Act, and before that, the Sugar Act, cracking down on molasses smuggling. Even Grenville, he didn't see them as punishments. One thing I did, and I'm embarrassed to admit it took me so long to do so, Roger, is I finally, for this book, read the Stamp Act. And one thing about it shocked me, and that is where the money went. And I am going to swipe the screen back again for 1 second. I'll remember to return it, because do you see those red rectangles on the map?
Yes. Right.
The British government decided at the end of the previous war, what was called the French and Indian War in 1763, to leave 10,000 troops behind. And those red, the big red boxes indicate large collections of troops. I think those are regiments, and then smaller ones are companies. So they're as far out as Chartres, is on the Mississippi River, and Detroit, as everybody knows where that is, and so forth. These were troops, I would describe them as peacekeeping troops. They're, yes, to protect the colonists from the Indians, but also to protect the Indians from the colonists. And again, not because anybody in Britain cared about Indians, but to prevent another war for them. My point is, how are you going to pay for these 10,000 soldiers that were left in America after the previous war in 1763? And the answer is the Stamp Act. That's why the Stamp Act was written. People think it was to help pay off the war debt. It wasn't. If you read that law, it's very clear it's to pay for those troops. And so, to use a modern phrase, these troops being sent out there are basically a human wall, keeping the Indians and the colonists apart. So I like to say that the Parliament said, we're going to build a wall on the western border, and we're going to make the colonists pay for it. And that was the Stamp Act. And I would say, I would go this far, Roger, and say, had there been no Native Americans, there would not have been a Stamp Act.
So you explained very well that there were not 13 colonies in the Americas, but 26.
That's right.
So explain a little bit more about the Quartering Act and its relation to the Stamp Act, and why exactly, I mean, you've sort of given us the answer, but why the 13 rebelled and the other 13 did not.
Right. So let me I may not be able to name them off the top of my head, but you've got Quebec and Nova Scotia, St. John's, which is Prince Edward Island, was its own colony, Bermuda, Barbados. There were two Floridas in those days. You're getting the idea. But the largest number of them, and the real wealth of the British Empire at that time, was the Caribbean, where they were growing sugar cane, yes, to make confections, but really to make rum. And so why did those British colonies in the Caribbean not rebel when these 13 did? And again, rebel is a tricky word, because I just went through my whole stadial view. They didn't rebel. Yeah. They were resisting change. But whatever, we'll use the word rebel for shorthand. But why did you not have a lot of riots against the Stamp Act, or a beating up of customs agents in Barbados and Jamaica? Because those colonies were 90% enslaved. And there's other reasons too. A lot of the big gentry, the leaders of those sugar colonies, they lived in London, and they sort of identified more with England than Jamaica or Barbados or wherever their plantations were. But the biggest reason was they didn't dare rebel, because they knew if they rebelled, they might get rebelled against. And so I think that's the biggest thing keeping them out.
So talk a little bit more about the demographic makeup of the 13 colonies that rebelled. I keep saying rebelled. No,
it's a good shorthand.
I literally 13 colonies, between whites and enslaved peoples. I mean, between North and South, and what it looked like.
Right. So we're talking about 2.5 million people overall, of whom 500,000, or 1/5, were enslaved in the 13 colonies that did rebel. And as you can see from the map, it's just barely true, but true, that the territory east of the Mississippi was still dominantly, the majority of it was still controlled by Native Americans at the time, although by this time the population of if you add up all the native nations together, it's a little more than 100,000 people. So in terms of population, the British colonies outnumbered the Indians east of the Mississippi, but they were still quite powerful, as you can see from their success at getting the British government to adopt that proclamation line. Let me mention real briefly, I'll add a star to my map because that blue star indicates the Wabash River. At one point, the Virginia House of Burgesses, and at that time, Patrick Henry, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson were all members of it. It unanimously voted to ask the British government to repeal that proclamation line. And the British government said, no, we're going to keep it. And the main reason why the British said no to Washington, Jefferson, and Henry, and all those others is the female peace chiefs living on the Wabash River. It's now the Indiana-Illinois border, about where my blue star is. They had begun in 1769 to revive the Pontiac Coalition, which had brought more than a dozen Native nations together to attack the colonies. And a lot of these Native nations, in fact, the majority, women, there were women chiefs who could be quite powerful, and they'd initiated this effort at the Alliance, and the British found out about that and ended up saying no to this effort on the part of Virginians to overturn the proclamation line along the Appalachian Mountains.
So, I mean, at least in my day, you know, kids learned the revolution was all about taxation without representation, and that still seems to be a rather simplistic mantra that's drilled into school kids since they really have very little time to study the revolution today. In chapter 7, which you entitled From Bengal to Boston, you run through all the various acts and maneuvers by Parliament to gain control over the colonies. How can you summarize, you know, all of these acts? You mentioned a few: the Sugar Act, Quartering Act, we talked about a little bit. Sort of run through the chronology that led the 13 colonies to say, okay, enough is enough.
Right. Well, let me say first that I agree with you that taxation without representation is inadequate for explaining the revolution. But I think you and I can also agree that was significant because the colonists, even though the Stamp Act was a pretty serious tax, the tea tax was not very big. The tax on, who cares about a tax on lead and painter's colors and even glass? That was not the that's the so-called Townsend Duties of 1767. Most of these taxes were not huge. Nothing like the taxes that the colonists were going to have to pay after the Revolutionary War once they were independent, because they had to pay huge taxes to pay off the Revolutionary War debt. My point is the taxes weren't large, but the colonists understood the power of precedent. You know, the old expression about letting the salesman get his foot in the door or the camel's nose under the tent. The colonists were right about that. They were not being paranoid, because historians, including me, have uncovered letters from British officials saying, once we get them used to this, then we'll crank it up even higher. So I think they were absolutely sincere about taxation without representation. Some of the other issues, the Townsend Duties, that's another one where some people think, okay, here's Britain trying to tax the colonists in order to pay off the debt from the previous war or for whatever. But no, the whole purpose of the Townsend Duties was Britain wanted to spend more money in Britain, in that case, because Britain wanted the governors and the chief justices of the provincial courts in all 13 colonies to be paid out of crown royal funds rather than by the local legislature, because it's like the old marionette, whoever is paying you is pulling your strings. And so that was the purpose of the Townsend Duties. And the reason that the British government wanted that control over the governors and the Supreme Court justices and other justices, I think the attorney generals were also included, was that the laws on the books were fine with so far as Parliament said, but the laws weren't being enforced. For instance, the colonists weren't supposed to import any molasses from French and Spanish islands in the Caribbean with which to make rum. If you consider a distillery a manufacturing operation, that's really the first manufacturing operation in America, is all of those distilleries. I mean, they were little iron forges and things like that going on too, but on the grand scale, the big industry is distilleries that are turning molasses into rum. And you could get it in Barbados and Jamaica, but you couldn't get enough. And so the colonists were buying it in the French and Spanish islands. They even did it during the French and Indian War. And that's so infuriating, even to William Pitt, who loved the colonists so much, and they loved them back. That's why Pittsburgh is one of the two biggest cities in Pennsylvania. But even Pitt was furious that they would trade with the enemy during the war. So you want me to run through chronologically? Let me do that as a quick summary. That during the French and Indian War, the British government's getting madder and madder at the colonists for trading with the enemy, for provoking wars with the Indians, and for other reasons, printing paper money we haven't talked about. But that's really the first stage. I started with the British government's reforms. That's really the second stage. It's the French and Indian War that persuades Britain that it needs to do all of those reforms. And then what are the reforms? The Sugar Act of 1764 is a crackdown on molasses smuggling, among many other things. And then the Stamp Act in 1765, as I say, its stated purpose was to pay for those 10,000 soldiers to be left in America after the French and Indian War. That's 1765, 1760, and also the year of the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act never placed a single soldier in anybody's house. That's one of the myths we all learned in grade school. In fact, it explicitly said nobody's going to be placed in anybody's house. What the Quartering Act was a tax. It was in effect a tax because it said the local legislature, wherever we the British government, decide to put those red rectangles representing British regiments, wherever we station our troops, the local legislature has to come up with the money to feed and house those troops. So the Quartering Act was another example of taxation without representation. So that's like the Stamp Act in 1765. 67 is the Townsend Duties. The most important one is the one on tea, because they actually repealed the others in 1770, but kept the tea tax. And then Parliament adopted a very complicated Tea Act in 1773, meant to save the East India Company, which was having terrible problems in India, primarily because of a guy named Hyder Ali who was attacking their possessions there. And so I make the case that Hyder Ali helped provoke the American Revolution, and he also helped bring it to an end, because in 1780 he was giving the East India Company a hard time again, and the British decided we need to stop fighting in America so we can deal with Hyder Ali, as they eventually did.
Just as a sidebar, it's a great trivia question. Where was the last battle of the American Revolution? So many people will say Yorktown, and I love saying no, Cuddalore, India. This is the absolute last battle of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
So in chapter 13, you outline some very real, but also some suspected insurrections by enslaved peoples in the South and in West Indies. And in your research, what were the reactions in the North to these slave insurrections, whether they're real or imagined?
Well, it is worth remembering that only 10% of those 500,000, roughly 500,000 enslaved people lived in the northern colonies. And yet, the very first report we have of enslaved people kind of scratching their heads and going, wait a minute, there's an opportunity for us here. Because you've all heard the expression that the British Empire used to rule the world was divide and conquer. But actually, it was the British who were dividing and potentially conquerable starting in 1774, as they divided into, on the one hand, loyalists who were sticking with the crown and patriots who were resisting all these measures, like the closing of the port of Boston. So Abigail Adams in September of 1774 heard a rumor, which, as you pointed out, might have been wrong, but what matters for anybody's motivation is what they think is going on. And she clearly believed this rumor that a group of enslaved Bostonians had approached Thomas Gage, who was both the governor of Massachusetts and the commander in chief of His Majesty's forces in North America. And they had said to Governor Gage, we are prepared to fight for our king. Give us a musket, promise our freedom, and we will do that. And so that's way early in September 1774, when if you went around and polled most colonists, at least south of New England, very few free colonists wanted independence at that point. But September 1774, Abigail Adams notices it. November 1774, James Madison notices it in Virginia. What am I talking about when I say it? It's these appeals by African Americans to British officials saying, look, we know you need help. There's not that many loyalists in this colony. There weren't in most colonies. New Jersey had quite a few, as you know. So did South Carolina, where I live. But most colonies had very few white loyalists. And so African Americans figured out the British needed help. And they came in probably most people watching have been to Colonial Williamsburg. They came to the governor's palace and literally knocked on the door and said to Governor Dunmore, who'd made some idle threats about raising the slaves, they said, we heard that, here we are, put us to work. That was in May of 1775. He turned them away, but they kept coming. They kept coming. And eventually he quietly welcomed them. There was a guy named Joseph Harris who served him as a harbor pilot. He formed something he called the Ethiopian Regiment. They won a battle against the Princess Anne County militia, that is the Patriot militia, whose commander was captured by one of his own former slaves. Imagine that conversation with the bottom rail on top now. But it was only after all of that that Governor Dunmore finally issued his Emancipation Proclamation of November 15th, 1775. So here's my point. The Declaration of Independence says, as its capstone grievance against the king, he has excited domestic insurrection amongst us. That's a reference to this alliance. I call it an informal alliance between the British and the blacks. And the white colonists were furious about that alliance, but they also kind of misstated it in the Declaration of Independence when Congress said that the king, or rather the governors, had incited domestic insurrection, that is, stirred up the slaves. Because the chronology I just gave you was the opposite of that. That is, it was African Americans who kept trying to reach the British and say, put us to work, we'll do this. And they kept being turned away and they kept coming. And only when the British really became desperate did they go along with this initiative from Black Americans. And so this is one of the things that I'm most excited about in the way that historians are rewriting the revolution, is that African Americans were really part of this story. And so, you know how Nick Cage broke into the National Archives and stole the Declaration of Independence? I'm going to break into the National Archives and edit one line. I love that document. It's my favorite secular document ever, but I'm going to edit it because it says, referring to the king and the slaves, he has excited domestic insurrection amongst us. And I'm going to cross that out and wrote, the slaves have initiated an alliance with the British. African Americans, not all of them, of course, but the ones who did this, they really played a crucial role. And if you want to understand why the revolution happened, you've got to know what enslaved people were up to, in my opinion.
So we talked a little bit before everyone else got on board here. This week, Nicole Hannah-Jones's book 1619 Project was released and is selling gangbusters. And one of the premises that she suggests, which I know she's toned down a bit, is that the revolution was primarily fought for the protection of the institution of slavery. We spent quite a bit of time going through all of the various parliamentary efforts to really just enforce laws that were already on the books. The colonists had been self-governing for many, many years, and the really, now that Parliament was trying to put the thumb screws and enforce those laws, how much weight would you give all of the various parliamentary acts versus this concept that well, really it was this general statement that the revolution was fought primarily for the enslaved people.
Right. Well, of course, it's an impossible question, but it's a fun question to try to make a pie chart of motives. But the biggest thing I would say is that you have to make 4 or 5 pie charts for different periods, because I would say enslaved people were no part of the decision of the battles over the Stamp Act. Well, I shouldn't go that far, because here in South Carolina, we had white guys running around Charleston saying liberty, liberty. And so a group of blacks started running around Charleston saying liberty, liberty, meaning free us, free us. So they were never not part of the story, but they weren't a major part of things when we're talking about the battle over the tea tax or the Stamp Act. Where they became influential was later. And that is after the colonists have resisted all these things like Stamp Act and the closing of the Port of Boston and so forth. And that all really culminates in the Boston Tea Party. And then the British are looking for ways to crack down on the colonists. And one of the ways they cracked down on them was Dunmore's proclamation. And then I'd say the pie chart after November 15th, 1775, well, really earlier than that, I'd say probably in the spring of 1775, when Governor Dunmore issued his threatened to issue that Emancipation Proclamation, and then even more so in November when he does issue it. At that point, the pie chart really shifts, and the role of African Americans in the South becomes important. Right. It's really in the South, where 90% of them lived, that they had the huge impact.
So shifting gears a little bit, you suggested that the founders were paternalistic in their approach to political power. The only time you mentioned the ideals of enlightenment on which many of the founders were schooled is in chapter 4 with respect to science and religion. But you also explained that the Constitution is primarily formed as a capitalist construct for the government, and yet the economic Enlightenment writings of Adam Smith and John Locke presented much more progressive philosophy of noblesse oblige. Are you suggesting that all the founders were paternalistic oligarchs?
No, but I want to underscore what you just said. Wealth of Nations was published in the same year as a Declaration of Independence, and it's in many ways a very progressive document. For one thing, he says New York City is going to be the capital of the British Empire by 1876, and it was the capital of the world pretty soon after that. But also he is opposing the East India Company, for instance, which I talked about and saw all the horrible things that it was doing in India. He was not big on slavery either. A lot of those Scottish philosophers like Adam Smith were anti-slavery. But he's opposing monopolies. I think a lot of people quote Adam Smith today as though he's saying there should be no OSHA or EPA or government regulations. But that wasn't. He was against big government, but the big government that he was against is what today we would call crony capitalism, right, where if you're a friend of the king, then you get to be a proprietor of Carolina or on the board of the East India Company or things like that.
So as capitalist as he was also suggesting the equality and for equality and pay. In chapter 34, you explain the 3/5 clause and the Electoral College were two compromises that the northern states accepted to gain constitutional consensus with the South. And since 1863, the southern states and other reactionary states' rights legislatures have been leveraging Jim Crow voting rights restrictions and the expense of civil rights to seize power. no, there's a question about how race has been the target of these anti-democratic efforts. But throughout our history, immigration has fueled these populist demands to resist progressive democratic societal evolution at the ballot box. But in 245 years, we've evolved into a powerful nation despite our issues with race and immigration. Given all your research on the founders, men and women, what do you think they would think of us now, the descendants? I mean, what do you think the founders would think of us now in terms of everything that we've managed to accomplish?
Great question. I'd love to hear other people's answers to that because I don't have any expertise-based answer, but I'll still just as a
This is the time warp, what Liz Covart calls the time warp.
yeah, I'm happy to play that game. I would like to introduce Jefferson to Mark Zuckerberg so that Jefferson could see that there was a possibility of becoming enormously wealthy, much wealthier than he ever was, without enslaving people. I think that he and Washington were, and again, it's a fun question, but also, as I'm sure you'd agree, a ridiculous question to see what kind of conversation they'd have. But they were stuck in the mindset of, I can't have this this lifestyle without enslaving people, and they chose to enslave people, and it distresses me that's the case, because as I said, Declaration of Independence is my favorite document, but Jefferson can't be my favorite person anymore because he denounced slavery so eloquently, so often. And I know he said, oh, it's a wolf by the ear, we can't hold on, we can't let go, but he could have let go. He could have not bought as much wine, or even, I shouldn't say this as an author, not bought so many books. And then he could have afforded to free some of the people whose instead he was, he did what every slaveholder did. He divided families. He did it much less than others did. But that's one thing I would say. Now, to anticipate what you're going to say, well, Mark Zuckerberg's wealth can't happen until you go through industrialization. Industrialization, that whole 19th century version of capitalism was in a real sense based on the merchant capitalism of the 18th century, which was based on slavery. So I think Jefferson might say to Zuckerberg, sure, you can do it without enslaving people, but only because I did enslave people.
We're approaching this last question. We're approaching our 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and this seems like a good opportunity to open up conversations about the founding ideals, self-evident truths and equality, etc. How would you recommend historic interpreters and public historians approach discussing our semi-quincentennial?
Well, first by calling it the sesquicentennial, it's so much easier to say. But to take your question,
you just call it the semi-quin.
Well, okay, I like that. It sounds like sequin. The what I would, and I think a lot of interpreters are already doing what I'm about to advise them to do, and that is embrace the complexity. That is, yes, the original story, you could make a case, keep it simple because kids are only kids, but I have kids and they can handle, even when they were younger, much younger, they could handle complexity. And so to see that Jefferson is somebody who on the one hand wrote what became this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and on the other hand owned 600 people, I can handle those two thoughts at the same time, because everybody that I know has a terrible side and a great side. And so I would embrace the complexity, talking about everybody. And so I would reject both people on the left who would say, oh, Jefferson, he was just a slave holder. Well, no, he was a lot more than that. And people on the right who would say, let's not talk about slavery. He didn't know it. Slavery was wrong. Let's not judge the people of the past by present standards. And I go, okay, judge him by his own standards, judge him by his own words. I'm saying to all the people who've become so partisan on issues like the revolution, embrace the complexities and the ambiguities and the contradictions. This is one of the things I loved about writing about Abigail Adams. I told you a couple of things I really admired about it. There's a lot that I didn't. She wouldn't let her kids marry the people they wanted to, and the two of them sort of always regretted not, the one that got away, and they got away because of mom, which was ironic because her own mother tried to stop her from marrying John Adams. But I liked writing about her because I kind of loved her on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and hated her on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And that's how I think we should teach the revolution, to embrace the whole complexity of it, and specifically to separate the people from the principles. I mean, we didn't get into the big monuments controversy, but I'd be happy to. To me, no one wants to take down the Statue of Liberty. There's all sorts of controversy about, of course, Robert E. Lee, but even some people about Jefferson and Washington. No one wants to take down the Statue of Liberty because she represents a principle. That no one's going to research. Oh, I see that she used to abuse her children or something because she's an allegory. And that's what we should be doing. Don't let go of our hero worship of the people, and instead let's worship what really matters about America, which are the principles of all men are created equal, and then all the way over to the First Amendment and freedom of speech, which is really under threat all over the country today.
Well, we'll have to save the monuments for next time.
Okay.
I want to encourage everybody to go out and get Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. You've done, I think, a masterful job in weaving together not only the military history, though you say you're not a military historian, you did a great job telling the story, and mixing in not only the social history, but certainly the history of all of the peoples involved, not just old white guys like me who are fascinated in our ancestors, but the Indians, and the nation's people, indigenous peoples. I loved your explanation at the beginning about what do we really call them, and certainly certainly the enslaved peoples as well. And I think you did a great job. If you're always welcome to come up here to the 10 Crucial Days historic area, I'd love to give you a tour. I give these tours all the time. I just gave a tour last week, and
I'm going to take you up on that someday, because I've been there, but I haven't been there with an expert, and I would really love to.
Yeah, well, we love giving these tours. In fact, one of the people who's on the show tonight is one of the interpreters at Washington Crossing, who himself has written a number of books on on the 10 Crucial Days, the Road to Assunpink Creek, and a few others that are excellent. So, but I want to thank you for your time, and I encourage everybody to go to historyauthortalks.com. You'll find Woody's books listed at bookshop.org. There's a link there where you can buy all of Woody's books, all well worth reading. And we also hope that you come visit us for our upcoming show. In fact, Woody, we have Cole Jones is coming up in January with
that's a wonderful book.
His book, yeah, which is terrific. Yeah. And Don Haggist, who is the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, has a new book on the British Light Infantry. And my good friend David Stewart, who has written a marvelous biography of George Washington, is coming on the show in January to tell us about his new fiction saga of German immigrants through American history. So that's a terrific show coming up. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and my audience. I love it. You guys are so dedicated in coming and seeing me. And Woody, thanks so much, and happy holidays to everybody, and good night.
Thank you. I'm going to come back as a member of that audience, because you got some great speakers. I know all those authors, and they're great. So can't wait to see them.
Excellent. Good night, everybody.
Take care.
Roger, thanks.
You bet.
Thanks, Roger.
Take care.
Bye-bye.